another RodCast from the descendant of Old Hickory, and you can see all of my RodCasts on YouTube. John Donelson came from Virginia in the mid-1700s, where he worked at the House of Burgesses. He was married to a woman named Rachel Stockley, and together they formed one of the great pioneer families in the history of America. As they started on their journey as pioneers through the Cumberland Valley, Tennessee, they had a son named John Stockley, who stopped off in Crab Orchard, founded it, and they moved on to Tennessee and Kentucky, where their 10th child, Rachel, we'll call her Rachel II, became married to a man named Robards for a short, I believe it was 48 months, and then decided to leave and found love in another man named Andrew Jackson. And as she explored this new relationship, John Donelson started work on Fort Nashville and made it a centerpiece, really, in country music and in America by changing the name to Nashville, Tennessee, and becoming the founder of the great country music heart here in the United States. Later on, John was murdered. Some believe it was by Indians, but they went on to dedicate a town called Donelson, Tennessee, to my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And so the story sort of moves on from there and gets dominated, really, by President Andrew Jackson and all of his escapades, which included taking Rachel down to the South, to New Orleans and Mississippi, and marrying her, and then the marriage being called into question by Mr. Roberts in Kentucky. And there were some issues there, but lo and behold, they granted Mr. Roberts the first divorce in the state of Kentucky from Rachel Donelson, who then, for the second time, married Andrew Jackson, becoming Mrs. Rachel Jackson, and the First Lady of Tennessee. And Mr. Jackson went on with his military career to liberate or stop the aggression from the English, who were pushing in New Orleans into what had become the Confederacy. And Jackson stopped him almost upon his arrival immediately. And so the British Navy set up in the Gulf of Mexico and began to intimidate, as I guess you would say. And so Jackson rolled some cannons in and refused to leave, although they were going to be outnumbered for sure. Jackson stood his ground, and the naval ships moved out. And it could be construed that they may have went to the other side of the Gulf in an effort by the English to sort of join the Spanish conquest there in Florida and sort of change the battle lines, if you will. And President Monroe contacted General Jackson, Andrew Jackson, and asked him if he would go and check and see if he could bring some semblance to the Confederacy through Georgia and Florida, where there was some unrest. And so Jackson left his wife at Hermitage in Tennessee and took his band of Tennessee militia, which was really a statement for America, because it wasn't just soldiers. There were slaves that joined willingly. There were Indians who joined willingly because they started to believe in the cause, I think, personally, and followed Jackson down through the South. And Jackson did some outrageous things. He really did. One of the situations that occurred were 3 soldiers decided they were going back home to Tennessee, and Jackson had told them to, mind their course, and they refused. They started to pack up, and they said, you know what, we just want to go back. And Jackson shot and killed those 3 soldiers. And so you can imagine the troops fell into line rather quickly, because there was no doubt who was in charge, not only of that Tennessee militia, but of any area that he seemed to go in, he was in charge. And that's why President Monroe sent him. And so as he traveled down south and ended up in Florida, somewhere around the Georgia-Florida line, probably, in the Panama area, up through there, he found some Englishmen supporting the Spanish and the Indians, and arrested them and took them to court there in Florida, where the judge did find the Brits guilty of treason and sentenced them to death, and they were shot, killed, hung. And they sent word to Jackson that the judge was actually going to let the other man go because of a political issue. He was a right-hand man to the King of England, and they didn't want to invoke the British to begin another all-out war and send their navy back over here again. So Jackson made a decision and went back to the court while the man was being discharged, basically, and objected in a way that really took the Confederacy to a whole new level in that Florida Panhandle unrest issue, because he overrode the judge, and he shot him and killed the Englishman. So the judge, I'm sure, found himself in quite a pickle and stood down, and he may have even been detained by Jackson, who was basically invoking his might through the Confederacy as the Southern general that represented the United States of America in a unification effort to remove the enemy, which were people who were not going to be part of the collective. And so as he went through Florida after that, there were some battles, but he wasn't really tested because they knew that they were a part of the United States at that point. And so he became the voice, or the mayor, or the congressman, if you will, of Florida to President Monroe. And once everything was settled, began his trip back, which I'm sure he collected even more soldiers following the cause. As he went back to Tennessee, to Hermitage, and to Rachel, he was asked to be the lead or the head of the new party, which he founded, called the Democratic Party. And of course, Rachel was getting pretty fed up with all of the political issues, the disdain that people were starting to have for her as his political enemies started to attack, which were the other political parties around the United States. And of course, the English couldn't stand him, the Indians couldn't stand him. There was a lot of people who couldn't stand him. But he became president, of the United States of America and sat through the 7th presidency. But before he left for Washington, he was dealt a blow that no man could even imagine. When Rachel passed away, the love of his life. And they claimed that he could barely breathe and that you could hear him crying and asking God why all the things that he had been fighting for departed from him there with her. And I'm sure that's how he felt. But he was able to gain enough strength to leave Tennessee and to go into Washington with his First Lady being appointed by Rachel before that in Emily Donelson. And Emily went as a very young lady in her young 20s and represented the United States of America on behalf of Tennessee, on behalf of the Donelsons, and on behalf of Andrew Jackson, our 7th president. And they had a lot going on. He took the banks on. His presidency is quite legendary. There was a lot of issues as far as how we were going to be governed, how we were going to finance commerce, and how we were going to deal with a lot of the issues out there as far as America being unified. And then late in the presidency, there was a tiff between Emily Donelson over the petticoat affairs and Andrew Jackson. And Emily wanted to banish one of the employees, and President Jackson did not. And so the argument went on for a while, and then Andrew Jackson asked her to leave. Some say that she left on her own. She went back to Hermitage, Tennessee, and was welcomed there by the state of Tennessee as one of the great women in American history, not only as a pioneer, but as a volunteer. And Tennessee recognized it on her departure from this world when they said that every church bell in Tennessee rang in solidarity to celebrate the life of one of the great first ladies in these United States of America. Later, there was a book written called Emily Donelson of Tennessee. If you get a chance, have your daughters read it. It's the story of a legend, a woman who left 29 years old from this earth after serving one of the great countries developing in history in these United States, and did her job well alongside a man who carved out the South and took the Southern values, went to the White House, and evolved really with America through those tumultuous times, and signed in one of the most controversial bills ever signed, which was the Indian Removal Act. And I believe that he did it in an effort to save the American Indian, because the Indians were being slaughtered where they were, because they weren't abiding by some of the treaties that were signed, and the government wasn't abiding by their end of the bargains either. And so it was a very difficult time to really understand the Trail of Tears, which is one of the saddest stories this world has ever known, because it was actually the ratification of a people, of a philosophy, of a way of life, and we will always be forever indebted to the American Indian. But in the progression of the United States, it had to be some complicated decisions, and the decisions which I can't sit here and pretend to understand, and I don't think other people should either. We're not going to change history by bitching about it. And the greatest compliment you can ever pay to history is to learn and grow from it. And that's what we want to do here in the United States.